Hello, everyone, and welcome. Good morning to our Pacific and Mountain folks joining us, and happy lunchtime, I guess, to the Central and Eastern attendees. My name is Julie Maurer, and I'm a partner here in the Husch Blackwell office in Phoenix and a leader of the firm's national transportation practice. We are extremely excited to have you all join us today, less than 1 week from the big elections taking place. Before we start with our presentation, I've been asked to do a few housekeeping reminders, and those of you who were able to join the webinar a little bit earlier saw some of this information scrolling through the slides, but I'll go through it real quickly again regarding some options that are on your screen that you might want to be aware of. First, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, we will hold them until the end, but please submit them via the question box that's on the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We will do our best to answer it live during the webinar. If we run out of time for any reason, it will be answered later thoroughly via email. There is also a PDF of the presentation available in the program materials folder, or feel free to email me directly and I'll happily provide you that information as well. We have auto-generated closed captions available for today's program. To turn the closed captions on, simply click a CC button that should be on your screen in the bottom right-hand corner of the media player box. The program also has been approved for legal education hours. For live attendees, you can report your hours by clicking on the CEU icon that's also on the bottom of your screen. A certificate of attendance, including the course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, and we'll also email you a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing as you deem fit. And finally, toward the end of the program, we will provide a brief survey. If you're so inclined, we'd love to get your feedback so that we can better format future webinars and informational materials that best suits your needs. So we thank you in advance. Should you have any feedback or suggestions for future content. So that's all for the housekeeping matters. We will begin the presentation. As I stated earlier, my name is Julie Maurer, and today I have 3 members of my immediate transportation team to discuss areas that may or will be affected by next week's election. And while there are 4 of us here today representing Husch Blackwell, know that we have over 250 attorneys throughout the country dedicated to the transportation industry for both national and international issues. And when I say use the term transportation, and I do those air quotes intentionally, it doesn't only mean transportation specific entities, although we do represent ocean carriers, motor carriers, air carriers, but we also represent, in a larger context, anyone that is involved in the supply chain and all related issues there too. So when you think of manufacturers, direct or third-party providers, warehouses, port entities, that's just a sampling of supply chain representation that we provide. And with that comes a host of issues, as those of you in the industry no doubt are aware of on a daily basis. For us, we consult with clients daily and advise regarding regulatory concerns. We assist with contract drafting to as far as protections and or liability limitations to put in place, contract advice, negotiations, anything related thereto, merger and acquisition assistance, IP and trade areas we regularly are involved in, import and export issues, which one of our presenters, James, will touch on a bit, the detention and demurrage issues of late and the related strike, as well as that we provide litigation counsel and defense across the globe. So I'd like to draw your attention real briefly to the 7 bullets at the bottom of this slide. That's a sampling of the areas that we provide representation for. Happy, any one of us in this presentation, happy to provide more information to you in that regard, or our website also goes a bit more in depth as to the scope of our expertise in that area. I also wanted to show you this slide real briefly because in the transportation supply chain context, obviously issues that arise are not specific to the location of your company, and it's not it's a national scope of the issues that arise for you. So wanted to think this map is a great representation of the scope. We have attorneys licensed that can assist in 46 of the 50 states, realizing that issues aren't arising in one market or one jurisdiction for you. So we're able to provide counsel as a one-stop shop wherever your needs occur. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to our first presenter, Aaron Schepler. Aaron is a experienced litigator, seasoned litigator with over 20 years experience. Aaron serves as senior counsel here at Husch Blackwell, advising and representing transportation clients on a daily basis. He is an essential part of our transportation team. And with that, I will pass the baton to Aaron.
Julie, thanks so much for that great introduction. Again, my name is Aaron Schepler. The issue that I'd like to talk to you about today is tariffs, what they are and how they affect the supply chain. And you might be asking yourself, why are we talking about tariffs in the context of a presidential election? Well, for a number of reasons, tariffs really affect and are tied to so many different facets of our economy and the supply chain. Certainly they affect foreign trade. They can help remedy trade imbalances. Tariffs can affect consumer prices, although the degree to which they do that is certainly a subject of debate. Tariffs certainly generate revenue for the United States government. But important to our discussion today is the fact that although Congress has the power in the first instance to regulate trade with foreign nations, Congress has delegated much of that power to the executive branch of government, which means essentially the president. So this is very much a presidential issue and one that has already become a focus in this election. If you need proof of that, look no further than the recent presidential debate in which these two candidates squared off on this issue of tariffs. Let's take a look.
My opponent has a plan that I call the Trump sales tax, which would be a 20% tax on everyday goods that you rely on to get through the month. Economists have said that that Trump sales tax would actually result for middle-class families in about $4,000 more a year because of his policies and his ideas.
First of all, I have no sales tax. That's an incorrect statement. She knows that. We're doing tariffs on other countries. Other countries are going to finally, after 75 years, pay us back for all that we've done for the world. I took in billions and billions of dollars, as you know, from China. In fact, they never took the tariff off because there was so much money they can't. It would totally destroy everything that they've set out to do.
So clearly, these two candidates have vastly different views about what a tariff can do and what it's supposed to do for the economy. But let's talk first about what a tariff is. A tariff is, as you see there, a tax of sorts, as the vice president pointed out, imposed on foreign-made goods paid by the importing business to its home country's government. So just to use kind of a mundane example, let's assume for a moment that Walmart wishes to import a load of Chinese-made shirts. And let's assume further that the U.S. has imposed a tariff on clothing made overseas. So in order for Walmart to import those Chinese-made goods, it has to pay a tariff to the government when it imports them. Now, exactly how much that is and how it's calculated will depend in large part on what kind of tariff is in place. And there are different types of tariffs that impose these taxes in different ways, and we'll talk about the different ways in which that's done. So the next question is, why would we want to, why would the United States or any country want to impose a tariff? And the reason is that they're intended to protect local industries by making imports more expensive and thereby driving consumers to domestic products. And as we'll see, tariffs affect different portions of the economy in different ways. For retailers, for example, it increases the cost of the goods that they sell to consumers. For manufacturers, it increases the cost of the raw goods that they turn into their products. And for consumers, to one degree or another, it affects the final price that we pay for goods at the register. As it turns out, many scholars will agree that tariffs have really been an important part of the United States economy from the very beginning of the Republic. And in fact, at least in the early days of the country, really allowed the economy to flourish. And so we might ask ourselves, who is it that thought of tariffs? Who is it that who really put this idea in motion? And really, we can really chalk it up to one person. That's Alexander Hamilton. Not only did he inspire a wildly popular Broadway musical, he was also, as you know, one of the founding fathers of our country. And he was an early proponent of tariffs. Alexander Hamilton not only was a founding father, he was also the first Secretary of the Treasury. He believed that political independence was founded on economic independence. In other words, if this country could stand on its own 2 feet economically by selling its goods abroad, then in turn, our political freedoms would flourish. He asserted that tariffs were necessary, at least temporarily, to nourish what he called infant industries in the U.S. until they grow strong enough to compete abroad, at which point the tariffs could be removed. And so based on that description, you would think that tariffs would be something that perhaps in the early days of the Republic would be used to help strengthen and get the economy going. But in fact, it's been much more widespread than that, and it's used obviously up until today. As I mentioned earlier, Congress really has the constitutional power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. And it exercised that power pretty vigorously from at least the beginning of the 19th century up until the mid-20th century. Congress pursued a very aggressive protectionist policy, imposing tariffs in many situations in order to protect U.S. industries from foreign competition. This practice hit its apex, or perhaps even its lowest point, depending on how you look at it, in the 1930s during the Great Depression. In 1930, Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, in which it raised something like 900 separate tariffs on foreign-made goods. It was meant to ease the financial suffering of the Great Depression, but most analysts agree that it actually backfired and made it a lot worse. Then in 1934, something very interesting happened. Congress, for the first time, delegated some of its power over tariffs and trade negotiations to the executive branch of government. And so from at least the mid-1930s up until the mid-1970s, various legislation really strengthened the power of the president to impose tariffs and to raise tariffs and to negotiate trade agreements with foreign nations. Under these various laws that Congress has passed, the president can raise tariffs in various situations, and I've listed some of them there. And as you can see, just reading those descriptions, these are the kinds of things that in a time of economic downturn, or in a situation like we face today, where we have trade partners like China who are really asserting dominance on the world stage, that a president would seek to I guess, mobilize tariffs to try to remedy some of these things. In the recent past, at least, both President Trump and President Biden have availed themselves of these powers. Certainly, President Trump has been the most vocal proponent, as between himself and President Biden, of tariffs. And as you can see there, he imposed a great number of them on all kinds of different goods, solar panels and washing machines, pretty steep tariffs of 30 to 50%, steel and aluminum tariffs there on raw goods that were used in manufacturing, obviously in the hope that manufacturers would instead choose to buy American-made steel and aluminum. And also, in particular, the Chinese-made goods were, of course, the focus of a lot of those tariffs. He imposed something like 818 tariffs on different categories of goods of up to 25%. President Biden, for his part, perhaps more quietly, but perhaps just as vigorously, also imposed a number of tariffs. As you can see there, his focus was mostly on green energy type products like solar cells and batteries made in China that are used to power electric vehicles. Interestingly, as the former president alluded to in that video clip that we saw earlier, the Biden administration left in place quite a few of the Trump era tariffs, and whether the vice president, if she's elected, will change that, of course, remains to be seen. But despite the rather vigorous, relatively vigorous use of tariffs over the last two administrations, still only about 30% of import goods are subject to tariffs in the United States, with the rest being on a so-called free list. I found this chart on the website of the Council for Foreign Relations, and which graphically, I guess, illustrates the use of tariffs from at least 1900 up until the mid-2020s. And as you see there, as we talked about earlier with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, really reached its apex, the use of tariffs, in the 1930s. And as you can see, things began tapering off in the 50s and 60s up until in the mid to early 2000s, relatively quiet on the tariff front, if you will. And then in the last column there, it shows where President Trump imposed various tariffs. And you can see there's a considerable uptick in the use of tariffs, but nevertheless, it's still far below the rates that we saw in the 1930s and 40s. As I mentioned earlier, there are different kinds of tariffs, and these tariffs, depending on different factors, will influence the amount of tariff that has to be paid. Sometimes tariffs are levied as a fixed percentage of the value of the imports. That's an ad valorem tariff. Sometimes it's a fixed amount per item. That's a specific tariff. And then lastly, some tariffs only kick in or rise significantly after a certain amount of imports, certain level of imports have been reached. Those are called tariff rate quotas. The tariffs really vary greatly depending on the type of goods that we're talking about. At the present time, the tariff on passenger cars is relatively modest at only 2.5%. And as we saw with consumer goods like washing machines, it's considerably higher, up to 50%. So you might be asking yourself, if the importers of these goods are required to pay these sums to get their goods into the country, who's really paying for that? How do these costs get passed on to consumers? Do they get passed on, or are they absorbed? And in researching the question, I found that there are really two answers. One, it depends. It depends on the types of goods that we're talking about. It depends on who's conducting the study. And it's certainly clear that experts disagree. Here's one study that looked at tariffs on washing machines, solar panels, aluminum, steel, and goods from the EU that were imposed in 2018 and 19. So these would be Trump-era tariffs. They found that there was a net loss to the U.S. economy of $16 billion annually. So that sounds pretty bleak. But then here's another study that looked at retail prices on certain kinds of consumer goods. And that study concluded that a 10 percentage point tariff increase on a good only increased the final price for consumers by less than half a percentage point, which is quite modest and and perhaps most of us might not even notice that. And certainly these findings suggest that retail firms absorbed much of the tariffs initially in the form of lower profit margins. But one thing I think does seem to be clear is foreign nations aren't paying these tariffs. The former president mentioned in that video clip that he collected billions and billions of dollars from China, but it appears that when these tariffs are imposed, it's really the importers, obviously the retailers and manufacturers who are paying for them, and they pass some of those costs on, at least to consumers. The last question to look at is, are tariffs really effective? Do they work? And again, experts disagree on that. There are various studies that talk about these issues. One of the things that has been observed is that they can sometimes provoke retaliation. If we impose tariffs on one nation's goods, they will in turn impose tariffs on our goods, as the EU did with regard to some US-made products. According to one study by MIT, tariffs haven't really restored US jobs. One of the things that President Trump, when he was in office, said is that by imposing these tariffs and driving consumers and manufacturers and retailers to US-made goods, the hope was that some of those manufacturing jobs would come back home because it'd be too expensive to use foreign-made goods, and we'd have to produce these things here in the United States. Some studies and some experts agree that, or at least have concluded that that is in fact not the case. And sometimes there are, in some industries, negative employment impacts on certain industries like farming and others that rely on imported goods. So one thing that we might ask ourselves is, if President Trump is elected, is he going to, or reelected rather, is he going to impose more tariffs? We know how the vice president feels about them. Let's take a look at this video. It's from a recent interview that Trump sat for with the Economic Club of Chicago.
To me, the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff, and it's my favorite word. It needs a public relations firm to help it, but to me, it's the most beautiful word in the dictionary.
So I think that much tells us all we need to know about the former president's view on tariffs. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, James Duncan.
Thanks, Aaron. Much appreciated. As a segue from the prior slide, what we're looking at is not just the impact of tariffs at the ports, but we're looking more specifically at what happens when the ports shut down, what happened during that brief time when they were shut down earlier this year. Why did it shut down? What were the reasons why the ILA continued their strike? And then the related issue of automation, both at the ports, and then also how both political parties feel about automation in other areas, including automated vehicles, and how they fit into the supply chain at large. And finally, how both political parties are treating electric vehicles and how those are continued to develop, or whether or not they would want to continue developing and encouraging the use of electric vehicles in the supply chain. To begin with, so the ILA strike only lasted from October 1st to October 3rd, but in the months preceding, when the talks between the ILA and the port employers, they were concerned about a much longer strike. The last time the ILA really did a broad strike of this magnitude was 1977. And at that time, that strike went on for more than 7 weeks. I think it was 44 days. And to drive home the costs associated with that kind of strike, analysts estimated that we would have about $5 billion per day cost to the American economy for this ILA strike. Part of the reason is that the scope of the strike, it wasn't just one or two ports. We're talking about all of the major ports on the east seaboard, as well as the Gulf Coast. So more than 36 ports were impacted by this strike. And another thing the analysts pointed out was that for every day that the strike would continue, it would take approximately 5 working days to recover from just that one day of work stoppage. So we're talking about, if this strike had lasted anywhere near close to what the 1977 strike looked at, we'd be talking almost a year of backlogs and, untold losses and impact to the economy. And this is a situation where it seems like the ILA, the Longshoremen's Association, played their cards pretty well when it comes to using the pending election to get broad-based support from both presidential candidates and their camps. But the question was always going to be, how involved is the current administration going to be in stopping the strike or negotiating an end to the strike? Unlike some labor strikes where President Biden's group got involved, like the railroad strikes back in 2001, the president's office took a much larger role in seeing those negotiations handled. The Congress did not give the president power to directly negotiate with these types of contracts. So the only tool really left in President Biden's toolkit to move this along is the Taft-Hartley Act, which allows the president to order an 80-day cooling off period, which would have given the parties more time to negotiate and avoid a total stoppage at the ports. In response to rumors or any insinuation that President Biden would get involved, he staunchly denied it and said he wouldn't invoke the Taft-Hartley Act. But the ILA made it fairly clear that if the Taft-Hartley Act were enacted, that they would basically ensure that the workforce were limiting their involvement as much as possible, so that the work stoppage might not occur, but the work would slow up to almost the point of work stoppage. And so what ended up happening here, we only had about 3 days of strike. There was a tentative agreement reached on some of the material aspects, primarily the increase in wages and benefits for the ILA workers. And they decided to suspend any further strike action for 90 days, so until next year. So the main question on everyone's mind then is what remains. How big of a threat is the strike still, based on what terms the parties have yet to negotiate? And that is primarily focused in the area of automation. So while the ports don't currently have a great deal of automation when it comes to automated cranes and other heavy equipment, there is some. And the prior agreement between the ILA with the ILA did allow for at least potentially some increased automation at the ports. There's that quote there that as long as workforce protections and staffing levels can be negotiated, that at least some automation could be possible. The ILA president has noted that especially during the strike and leading up to the strike, that any type of automation should be stricken from a future agreement, which would be interesting, trying to walk back a prior agreed term. One of the main issues with automation, the idea that it would get rid of jobs for both clerks as well as those handling the heavy machinery itself. A lot of the proponents of automation indicate that this has as much to do with safety as anything else, as well as efficient movement of cargo. So the question remains, how do the different political parties, how do the different presidential candidates feel about automation specifically? And will they side with the ILA or with the employers? As mentioned previously, there was a lot of support from both Biden and Harris camps for the demands for increased wages and benefits. Both issued statements stating that that fair wages are very important and that they should make the deal. And kind of whatever influence they had of that decision, they really focused on benefits and pay, but they didn't talk about automation. And I think that's conspicuously absent. The issue is, if elected, would Vice President Harris back the union still? A lot of that has to do with whether or not she intends to follow in the footsteps of President Biden, who has been very vocally pro-union. But because this has more baked into it, including the efficient movement of cargo and that would benefit the economy at large, it's difficult to say how exactly she would react. However, it's a little bit more clear that there's at least been some indication that former President Trump, if reelected, would side with the employers when it comes to the automation points. To begin with, President Trump's camp came out the gates when the ILA strike was imminent, stating basically in an interview on X with Elon Musk that they go on strike, that's okay, you're all gone. That's kind of the quote. And in response, the United Auto Workers even filed an unfair labor practice charge against Trump and Elon Musk, since the National Labor Relations Act forbids employers from firing striking workers. But he changed his tune relatively quickly, noting that, deciding to turn to the impact on the economy, stating that inflation caused by the, Biden-Harris was at the heart of the strike, and really focused on the fact that a lot of the employer side is foreign-based interests, and Trump is notoriously, America first, and focusing on U.S. interests. It was also interesting to note that under the Trump presidency, the Department of Transportation did some interesting work into seeing whether and to what extent automated vehicles, so less the automation of the port systems itself, but the vehicles dropping off and picking up large containers at the ports, whether or not there could be automated truck queuing, so that the drivers wouldn't have to stay at the port while containers are loaded, that there could be some way to just kind of automate that whole part of the intermodal process. So I mean, that at least shows that there's some interest in automation. And an indication that, if elected, President Trump would be more interested in supporting the, efficient move of cargo, and perhaps less bullish on supporting the unions. And as a key up, not only was Trump a proponent of the automated vehicles used in the intermodal context at the ports, his Department of Transportation was very interested in exploring and beefing up regulations surrounding autonomous vehicles at large, including commercial motor vehicles as well as personal vehicles. Under his guidance, the FMCSA, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Act, issued some guidance, not any permanent rulemaking, but guidance that that the regulations during that period would no longer assume that there were a human driver present in all vehicles. The idea was to help promote companies that were aggressively or otherwise trying to use automated vehicles for their commercial purposes, would have some leeway and wouldn't be cited with, any kind of violation for exploring this technology, trying to put it into place safely. We also know that, recently President Trump has spent a lot of time with Elon Musk, who, of course, is at the heart of a lot of these automated vehicles, both commercial and for personal use, which seems to indicate that that former President Trump, if elected, would continue his support of the development of automated vehicles and try to provide more national regulation, interstate regulations regarding their use. Because at this point, all we have is a lot of patchwork. Different states have enacted laws regarding how automated vehicles may be used, how they may not be used, and that in part has to do with the Biden administration, which hasn't done much, which I'll get to in a moment. This slide talks about Project 2025, which, of course, the Trump campaign has stated that they aren't necessarily going to adopt the Project 2025 proposals, but these seem to be in line with at least what former President Trump did during his own administration, which is have guidance from the FMCSA, follow this automated vehicles 3.0 guidance and codify it. And instead of just having it be regulatory guidance, have some permanent rulemaking in place that allows for at least the commercial application of automated vehicles, as well as personal vehicles. The idea is also to have the NHTSA provide performance-based rules for operation of AVs instead of having any restrictions. Have it be more like they want, the Trump DOT wanted to provide a space for developers of this technology to work instead of restricting their use. How would, again, the Biden-Harris regime has focused more on electric vehicles and almost completely ignored automated vehicles. As I mentioned previously, the notice of proposed rulemaking that was brought forth by the Trump era DOT and FMCSA hasn't resulted in any rule. So we still don't have a national standard for vehicle safety when it comes to automated vehicles. But their Commerce Department, so the Biden Commerce Department, has recently proposed a rule that does deal with automated vehicles, speaking more to data privacy, data security, cybersecurity type issues. Systems, automated driving systems that are based either in Russia or China are proposed to be banned, I think beginning with models in 2025, 2026. And Trump also, his campaign has noted that they would also, if Trump is reelected, would just do a wholesale ban on any automated vehicles produced in China. So again, it seems like the campaigns are on the same page when it comes to how they feel about foreign interests coming into the automated vehicle space. Again, as with automation at the ports, there may be some sensitivity with the Harris campaign when it comes to the labor considerations of having automated vehicles. There are labor associations that deal quite a bit with intermodal transportation, and any idea that their jobs would be at risk through additional automation, including for commercial motor vehicles, there would at least be some pressure on a Harris presidency to avoid looking too far into automated vehicles. And for our next stop, just briefly, is the future still electric? The Trump campaign has made it very clear that they're not bullish on electric vehicles, although it's interesting that the relationship with Elon Musk and Tesla, I'm curious to see if in the event of a Trump presidency, whether that will temper anything other than what Trump has already promised, which is to eliminate competition from China, which of course would benefit the production of electric vehicles here in the United States. the Biden Harris, I guess the Harris campaign has indicated a continued interest in maintaining the Biden presidency's focus on providing funds for green energy across the United States. I think that they've had hundreds of proposals from different states and different state agencies to implement a nationwide infrastructure to support, interstate transportation using electric vehicles. And there's every indication that if elected, Vice President Harris would continue those investments and would seek to bolster the infrastructure to support electric vehicles and to continue revamping vehicle production plants to focus instead of on fossil fuels, on electric. And with that, I will turn the time over to Joe Barata, a fantastic attorney in our transportation team that's class act, excellent litigator, and looking forward to hearing his comments.
Thank you, James. James had touched on some of the regulation that the Trump and the Harris administrations are proposing. And my intention here is kind of just to touch on a little bit more of the regulation aspect and how it may be affected going forward, the post-Chevron decision this last summer. And so I think it goes without saying, whoever sits in the White House is going to have a profound impact on the country's transportation policy, even if it's really not the top issue of the campaign trail these days. Transportation and infrastructure was a central theme the last two presidential elections, with Donald Trump promising $550 billion, later up to $1 trillion in infrastructure. And in 2020, Biden himself enacted a $1.2 trillion infrastructure package. And so you got to understand what the federal government does with all this funding. It's important to understand the bureaucracy, which is made up of federal agencies, how these agencies are structured, and who really controls them to distribute the funds. Recently, with the talks over the last couple of elections of the deep state, we've seen a renewed interest directed towards presidents and the influence they wield over the federal bureaucracy, including how presidents appoint and remove employees, recognize the bureaucracy, reorganize the bureaucracy, and manipulate budgets to augment their control over the agencies within it. So while Congress itself writes the laws, administrative agencies do a lot of the work translating the vague and often conflicting legislative provisions into concrete public policy. Federal regulations are wide-ranging. There's over 400 federal agencies with over 200,000 pages worth of regulations currently on the books. So it's fair to say that it really affects every aspect of life, including transportation. So just quickly, a brief overview and a guide to how federal agencies come about, and then the rulemaking, which kind of gives them the teeth to go about doing their business. Agencies themselves get their authority to issue regulations from laws enacted by Congress. Typically, when Congress passes a law, they create an agency. It grants the agency either general authority to regulate a certain activity within society, or it may pass a law to direct an agency to act on a specific issue. There's also a third category, which is, in some cases, presidents may delegate existing presidential authority to an agency. Presidents can and often do strike out on their own. And since the end of World War II, presidents have unilaterally created over half of all administrative agencies in the United States, either using executive orders, department orders, or reorganization plans. Presidents have established administrative agencies that would frankly never have been created through the legislative process on its own. In all cases, any agency must not take any action that goes beyond its statutory authority or would violate the Constitution. And they need to follow the rulemaking process that's set forth in the Administrative Procedures Act, or the APA. The APA prescribes that when a new rule is going to be in effect, that there must be a statement of rulemaking authority published in the Federal Register, along with the proposed rule, a comment period, potentially a hearing if that it's deemed necessary and a follow-up period before a final rule is published. There's also a mandatory wait period before that final rule goes into effect. There we go. All right, so how does a federal agency itself begin to make a new rule? Well, Congress may pass laws that direct agencies to take action, but as mentioned before, Congress also may just create an agency and give it kind of broad authority to regulate a certain area of society. So then comes the, ask how does the president get involved? How does the agency decide to make a move or begin to regulate a certain area? Well, presidents can exercise significant more control over agencies that are created or simply in effect at the time of their presidency. They are the head executive. Oftentimes when Congress is a little bit weaker or is in a divided government, we see presidents kind of step out on their own and either establish new agencies or take a more direct approach when instructing agencies to regulate areas. Typically, this divided government, presidents take advantage of the gridlock and they push their agenda through these unilateral directives. To this end, an agency will usually just survey an area of legal responsibility and then takes action based on the goals and priorities of the current administration. As you may guess, as the head executive of the executive branch, the president's policies have a great influence in not only drafting the rules themselves for any given agency, but also the interpretive rules, policy statements, and other guidance documents, which may be issued anytime after a final rule is published, which kind of gives the public a little bit of a sense of how to interpret said rule if it's vague or a rationale behind a rule. Any agency publishing these explanatory rules can push forth how they interpret the regulation and how it may apply in a specific instance, as well as which person or entity, corporation, business, like, what they must do to comply with these new rules being issued. The interpretation of these federal rules leads us to a fun doctrine called the Chevron doctrine or Chevron deference. So real briefly, just to kind of set the stage and then, not to spoil it, but Chevron, it was a big decision back in the 80s and it was recently overturned this last summer. But in 1984, the Supreme Court decided Chevron versus National Resource Defense Council. And what it did was basically create a framework requiring courts to defer to an agency's interpretation of a statute administered by the agency. And what became known as the Chevron doctrine, courts established a two-step guideline for federal courts when interpreting cases of federal regulation. Step one, courts are to look at, if Congress had directly addressed an issue at hand, and if so, whether the statute on that issue itself was ambiguous. If the intent is clear in the statute itself, there's no issue, you do what Congress said. But it's oftentimes the case, these statutes are pretty vague. And if that intent behind the statute from Congress is ambiguous, you go to a second step. The second step was to determine if the agency's interpretation is permissible. In other words, is it rational or reasonable? And if that's the case, and as you might guess, it's a pretty lax standard, the courts must defer to the agency's interpretation. In effect, the doctrine gave federal agencies the power to interpret ambiguous statutes when they're challenged and taking the issue, frankly, out of the court's hands. This was the precedent for nearly 40 years when it came to regulatory ambiguity. And as you may expect, agencies took advantage of this power and strategically crafted all kinds of rules to further political interest under the guise of vague congressional mandates. This was such a powerful ruling from the 80s that it was one of the most cited decisions, being cited over 18,000 times. So that brings us to the Loper-Bright decision this past summer. So in June of 2024, the court decided that Loper-Bright Enterprises versus Romandio, which overturned the Chevron deference standard. In that ruling, the Supreme Court found that the APA requires courts to exercise independent judgment in deciding legal questions that arise from reviewing agency action. In other words, the courts can't simply defer to an agency's interpretation of the statute just because the statute itself is ambiguous. It kind of re-empowers the court to review some of these statutes and some of the vague language. So what are the implications of this ruling? Well, this directive that courts need to independently construe statutes has enormous implications, frankly, for all administrative agencies across the board, and including the Department of Transportation and the dozen or so agencies it oversees, the FAA, National Transportation Safety Board, FMCSA, Transportation Security Administration, just to name a few. And so we expect that the courts are going to be taking a more involved approach in reviewing these rules, and reviewing the interpretation of these rules, and what was considered a technical process that was previously thought to be best served through the notice and comment process itself. Now the courts are going to be a little more active as it applies just to the transportation industry. The FMCSA has 6 final rules and 16 proposed rules currently in the pipeline. And so we expect to see a lot more scrutiny and a lot more challenges once those rules become final and published. We're even seeing agencies themselves kind of beginning to preempt this and take action based on this Loper decision. The FMCSA announced recently the general proceeding improvements to its rules and practice. There's a host of reasons for doing it, but one of which is to make sure that the rules are more understandable to the public and the regulated community and accommodate recent programmatic changes. This, in effect, it appears that they're trying to kind of head off and take affirmative action on, let's make sure that certain rules that are in place that may be vague or ambiguous or may not be looked upon friendly by a court, we can tighten up those rules and definite interpretations head on before a change in the administration or an opportunity for a strategic lawsuit in a friendly or unfriendly jurisdiction to come and challenge these rules. This is the first change in these rules since almost 20 years. Certainly this Loper decision is having some impact on these transportation agencies. So how does this kind of relate to the candidates themselves? We expect to see the candidates follow a traditional party track when it comes to regulation. Harris appears to be intent on continuing her predecessors' activist antitrust stance, taking a more hands-on approach to regulation. And we would expect first term of Harris to be proactive in shoring up administrative rules and limit ambiguity, which may be interpreted adversely in a post-Chevron world. In contrast, I think the GOP candidate, Mr. Trump, has already indicated a loosening of regulations and a focus on business efficiencies. So we expect the parties to kind of take that tack when it comes to regulatory agencies and whether or not they're going to shore up some questionable language or maybe let it falter for a strategic lawsuit. As Aaron and James had kind of touched on before, when it comes to transportation, it's worth keeping in mind that transportation policy for at least the candidates doesn't really, rather the candidates seem to merge transportation with environmental policy as well as energy policy. It's kind of hard to get one without the other. And so to that end, when it comes to, say, candidates, the Harris-Walz ticket, they tend to see transportation regulation through the agencies in the lens of environmental policy. Harris was a co-sponsor of the Climate Equity Act, and that required all kinds of environmental and climate-related legislation, and basically provided equity scores for different transportation entities. To that end, we also saw, at least under the Biden-Harris administration earlier this year, propose and enact a new rule. The U.S. Federal Highway Administration established a new rule with a performance-based method for measuring greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with the transportation on national highway systems. This rule instructed not only the U.S. Department of Transportation, but individual state Department of Transportation, some of which every one of them, to organize and provide plans to measure CO2 emissions. And so we would expect to see that the Harris ticket going forward, if she be elected in less than a week, to kind of push forward in some of these regulatory agencies to push on more of these green policies as they relate to transportation. Conversely, under maybe a second Trump presidency, we would expect Trump to not only shift away from the electric vehicles and emphasize fossil fuels, as you saw, and many of the campaign stops. There's been a proposed also to shift away from climate positions, withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. Again, it seems that it goes in limbo. It was Obama was in, Trump out, Biden in, possibly Trump back out. So it seems to be kind of in limbo. But we also see a push and can expect a Trump-Vance ticket to really pull back the reins on regulatory agencies in general, not just transportation, but reenact that what I call the 2-for-1 policy that Trump had in his first term. Basically, every new regulation that would be issued, 2 would be removed. And again, in that business interest, push big business, push energy, and away from environmental concerns. So those are just a couple thoughts in the limited time that we have here, but it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next week's election, and then going forward in either of the 2 candidate transition teams, how they wish to address regulation going forward. So with that, I will send it back to Julie Maurer.
Thank you, Joe. Well, we are reached the end. We are able to give you back at least a sliver of time to you busy folks. Want to thank you again for joining us today. We hope that you found the webinar both informative and thought-provoking. We encourage you to reach out to any one of us or any of your Husch Blackwell contacts for further discussion. And with that, the webinar is concluded, and we thank you for joining. Have a great day, everybody.